welcome to another segment of Untethered Layers. My name is Dawood Rachel.
This is Rachel Tyler.
I say segment, and I forgot that we've already graduated to our own show. So this episode is about, what record are we going to talk about, Rachel?
Well, we're talking about Eskimo Snow.
We were talking about Eskimo Snow. Came out in 2009, but as we mentioned last week, a super fun fact is it was... I wasn't sure if it was written and recorded at the same time as Alopecia, but it was recorded also in February of 2007, according to the Wikipedia page that I have open in front of me right now. And the reason I have this open, and this is something I want to talk about, and you're going to hear us talk about a lot this episode, is I am not as familiar with this record as I am with the other two we've talked about, or just any of the rest of them. I think you share the same sentiment.
This is probably the album that I'm least familiar with.
Yeah, and generally, the couple days leading up to whenever we record, we're recording this on a Sunday right now. The couple days before we record, I'll listen to the album a lot. I listen to Elephant Eyelash on repeat for a few days, and same thing with Alopecia. And I was doing it with this record, and I realized that that's probably the most I've ever listened to this record in sequence. Like, I listened to it probably 6 or 7 times leading up to this episode. And not even between just Rachel and I, but we talked last week about how just in general Y fans have a tendency to kind of kick this one to the curb. Not because it's any worse. I'm not mincing words here. It's people have a tendency to forget about this one more so than they do Elephant Eyelash, and then definitely Alopecia. And I think that's why. I think because this record followed Alopecia so quickly, it was bound to not be as it was bound to not resonate as much with fans as Alopecia did. Correct me if you think I'm wrong.
No, I agree. I think that Alopecia, I don't know if, Yoni and the band were anticipating how well Alopecia was going to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, I would love to hear, more of their experiences with releasing Eskimo Snow.
And the reception.
And the reception of this album. Were you, because last week you talked about how you got into Y around this time
this time, but like I said, whenever I had gotten into Y, I had only listened to Alopecia for probably about a year or two. So say I got into them around 2009, I had no idea this record was releasing at the time. I wasn't following the band, I was following Alopecia, and then I figured out the band after, like a few years after. So this wasn't even something that I was anticipating because I had only listened to Alopecia at the time. I wish that I had that experience of anticipating this record and kind of seeing the reception of it critically. It garnered really, really good critical reviews. I referenced a bunch of different album review sites, and none of them gave it below like a 7 or anything like that.
Wow.
At least as far as I saw. I think Pitchfork gave it a 6.9. Yeah, whatever. Yeah, but nice, first of all. But it, like, critically speaking and objectively speaking, I mentioned last time that this album doesn't fall to the wayside for me for lack of flair or for lack of how good it is objectively. It's just, I think, like I said, it following Alopecia, it had such big shoes to fill, and people resonated more deeply with the super specific sound of Alopecia and how deep and dark and different it was. And despite the fact that Eskimo Snow was written and recorded at the exact same time as Alopecia, it sounds, like we talked about last week, just like so much different. And last week I mentioned how there was only a few indicators that they were written and recorded at the same time. But the more I listened to this record, the more I realized that honestly the subject matter of this album is so similar, if not darker, than a lot of the tracks in Alopecia.
Yeah, that was something that I realized too, re-listening to this album over the past few days, was he talks about the same subjects over and over again in both Alopecia and Eskimo Snow, but for some reason it doesn't come across as immediately, I guess.
And I think it's because, and Yoni himself said, whenever he was asked about this record, he said that it's a more open sound for Y. It's, they had more, I think, like, just it sounded more open, more airy, more I think it gave more of a chance for the instruments to show in the studio recording of it. So the sound of it, especially compared to Alopecia, which is very kind of like muddled and like dark and deep, this one is a lot more, despite the fact that he's talking about the exact same stuff, the instrumentation around it sounds a little bit brighter. So you kind of have to do a double take to listen to what he's saying.
Yeah.
And in this record, he talks so much more about death than he did in Alopecia. he talks about a lot of shitty situations in alopecia, pretty much throughout every song, and some really dark subject matter. But there are so few songs on Eskimo Snow's track list, if any at all, that have an absence of death in the lyrics. There are entire songs about just him dying or his death on this track list. So, but like you said, it doesn't come across as immediately on this record.
The vocals are a lot more gentle, I feel, on this album versus kind of the mumble rapping that is in Alopecia, and the more experimental vocals in Elephant Eyelash, like pitching up, pitching down, overdubbing, things like that. Whereas this album has a lot more, less in your face vocals and singing. He's singing as opposed to rapping or talking.
I think it's a lot more straightforward than the other two albums. I think this album, unless I'm mistaken, is completely devoid of any samples. I don't think there are any samples or any different sound bites added in any of these tracks. Like I said, I can't recall every single track off the top of my head, so I could be wrong. But Elephant Eyelash, Fall Saddles had that sample of his dad's recordings. Alopecia had some samples,
multiple samples,
right? Yeah. But Eskimo Snow doesn't have that. It's very straightforward. It's like they kind of just did one studio session. And maybe on a brighter, sunnier day than some of the Alopecia recordings they had done. But despite the fact that a lot of the subject matter is the same between Alopecia and Eskimo Snow, at least the lyrics are, I think, not necessarily more hopeful, but he is asking a lot more questions than he is in Alopecia with a lot of the lyrics on Eskimo Snow. In Alopecia, he's sort of just dead-faced saying all these shitty situations that are happening to him. But in Eskimo Snow, he's full of some more, albeit twisted, wonder.
It's a little bit more of an exploration.
Yes.
Not as filled with wonder as maybe like Moline is. But yeah, something that I really noticed listening to Eskimo Snow was a return in some way to the coded poetry, or lyricism that Elephant Eyelash and some of his earlier work has. And it's so interesting that that's something that Yoni and the band does so well in terms of talking about different situations in a very beautiful or metaphorical way.
A lot more abstract than a lot of the lyrics were on Alopecia.
Right. That's something that they do so much in so much of their work, whereas their most popular album, Alopecia, doesn't have as much as that.
Yeah, and I think, like I said, despite the content being just as dark as Alopecia, if not darker, it feels like a breath of fresh air compared to Alopecia. It's like he said, the sound itself is a lot more open. Like you said, his vocals are a little bit more sing-songy, I think, than a lot of the tracks on Alopecia. And I think, like you said, talking about how his vocals sound a little bit more similar to those than maybe Elephant Eyelash or maybe Moline, even if the subject matter doesn't fit. I think even outside of Y's discography, you and I have talked in the past about how Eskimo Snow seems to be the most comparable to other music out of Y's discography. I read a bunch of album reviews. They picked track by track on Eskimo Snow, and I'm like, this one sounds like this era of Ben Folds, or this one sounds like blah blah blah. And I think this is one of the few albums you can actually do that with Y.
Right.
And Alopecia is so distinguishable because it is indistinguishable from any other kind of music.
Exactly. Like I remember we said, I think it was last week, that if all of Y's music sounded like Eskimo Snow, they would still be an incredible band, but they would be more comparable to other bands of that genre. Whereas exactly Alopecia and the breadth of their discography shows such a diversity and uniqueness that it's really impossible to compare them to any other band. And that's why when people ask me, what is this band you like so much? What genre is it? I kind of have a hard time
I'm at a complete loss for words.
Because saying hip-hop is not quite right, and saying, indie or alternative is... Like, all of those are fit, but it gives the wrong impression.
Whenever people ask me about why, I have a tendency to sort of separate it into almost three distinct periods, one of which we've already talked about, which is pre-full band. So if people are like, what does Y sound like? I'm like, it depends on when you're asking. Like 2004 and before that, really sample-heavy, very abstract lyricism, very mumble-rappy. and then Elephant Eyelash kind of transitioning out of that into Alopecia is just super distinct sound. Like I consider Alopecia almost an entire era of Y itself, and then post Alopecia, you know, there's Eskimo Snow. Mumps sort of falls a little bit, I think, closer to what I would say Alopecia sounds like.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
if I were to refer Alopecia to somebody, I would also probably refer Mumps to them. But then Eskimo Snow and Moline, a lot more breathy, a lot more open, like he said. Just a lot more, I think, not cheerful, but bright, I think, than Mumps or Alopecia, at least in terms of instrumentation and production. So yeah, I have a tendency to separate it into those 3 or 4 eras, and I can, you know, have 2 friends who have completely different tastes in music, and I can probably get them into Y just at different times.
Yeah, exactly. I agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
I think another thing that I wanted to say about the track list is that it's really short. It's a very short album, about 30 minutes.
Yeah,
I believe.
it's 35 minutes and 40 seconds.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah,
okay.
that was off the top of my head. I was not looking at the Wikipedia page.
Oh,
I was.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Well, you know, Alopecia is what, 50 minutes long, 48 minutes long, something like that.
Yeah, I think it's about 45. I'm not going to pull up that Wikipedia page. So
well,
yeah, it's 45 minutes long.
Well, something about, obviously we've already established pretty clearly that, you know, we've listened to Alopecia more, but all of those tracks on Alopecia stand out so strongly on their own, whereas the tracks on Eskimo Snow, even upon re-listen, still kind of blend together to me.
Right, yeah.
They have a lot of transitions within the songs, and even their, you know, One Rose and On Rose Walk, Insomniac, you know, those have a very similar title, and the songs, there's not as much differentiation between the melodies and the styles, so it's a little bit easier for me to talk about this album as a whole as opposed to breaking down track by track.
But I know both of us agree that we still would say we have definite favorites off of the record, which we'll talk about later. But yeah, no, I definitely agree. There are, like you said, in Alopecia, so many tracks stand out so distinctly that you have a hard time talking about the whole album without talking about individual tracks and how they play into it. But Eskimo Snow, like you said, with all the transitions and a lot of the shared imagery, I think, like I mentioned a little bit earlier, how it sounds almost like they went into the studio at the same time they were recording Alopecia tracks with just a different mindset maybe that day, and kind of just like busted out a whole bunch of these a little bit more hopeful songs, and we're like, well, this doesn't fit with anything else we've been recording recently, so maybe we should release it as a separate album. Once again, I don't want to speak for the band. They may have had completely different reasons as to why they separated the 2 albums, but I think that probably would have played into it, is that like I said, it's a lot more contemplative than Alopecia is. Alopecia has a sort of dark acceptance of the shitty situation that he's in, but this one is more like, why am I in this situation and how is it going to affect me? And also, I'm going to just talk about death like a lot, just like a ridiculous amount. Yeah. But do you want to go ahead and get into some of the tracks that we want to talk about?
I think we can do that.
I think I realized that because Rachel and I will try to pick, like I said last week, a couple of our favorite tracks, and we'll try to sort of differentiate them. That's not going to happen, I think, because we share a lot of the same tracks. So we'll probably just talk about them as they pop up. But I'll start this time since I made you start. Since I made you start the other time. And I just really desperately want to talk about this song, is Into the Shadows of My Embrace.
Oh,
yeah,
I want to talk about that
that's why I
one.
wanted to go first. So this is by far, I think, the most standout track on the record.
I would say so.
Yeah, we talked about Alopecia having a lot of defining moments, and I think this is the defining moment on Eskimo Snow. Just so many. I talked last week about Alopecia, at least some of the tracks and a lot of lyrics seeming like just a series of confessionals that, you know, he was kind of shouting out into the ether. This is definitely this falls into that line the most, Into the Shadows of My Embrace. That falls into the line of just like yelling and screaming out. There's a literal line that talks about that, which is I mentioned last week, a couple of my favorite lines like out of all of Y's discography are on this record. This line where he says, it's the entire second verse, but the last part of the second verse where he says, and I know saying all this in public should make me feel funny.
And I know saying all this in public should make me feel funny, but you gotta yell something that you never tell nobody.
That part is just so meaningful because it's a very specific feeling that I didn't realize was universal until I heard this lyric of this idea. You know how sometimes in like some people you follow on social media will have that phase where they sort of post a bunch of feelings on a black screen and they'll post it to their story or whatever. Have you ever seen stuff like that?
Yeah.
So that falls, I think, most in line with what I want to talk about with this line where he says, you know, but you got to yell something out you never tell nobody. It's like there's this it's really hard to talk one-to-one, like person to person about really, really deeply personal things. But if you just like yell it out into the void and for anybody to hear, it separates, I feel like, a lot of the onus. It separates a lot of the responsibility for those kinds of feelings and for those kinds of experiences, because you're not saying it to anybody in particular. You're just saying it to everybody, and whoever happens to listen to it. And that in itself can be so cathartic because you still get these really hard, deeply personal feelings off your chest, but
you don't have to.
Right, you don't have to worry about one very specific person's
reaction.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's just one of the most beautiful lyrics that, like, it's one of my favorite lyrics I've ever heard in any song because, like I said, it's such a specific feeling that I don't think a lot of people really think about, but I know a lot of people feel. Like I said, you know, these people that'll post their really personal stuff on their story. It's kind of just like, well, I don't want to talk about a friend to this, but I'll talk to everybody who's following me on my Instagram or anything like that. And I know you had some lines that you wanted to talk about on this.
Well, I think
track.
that the lines in this song are just so funny and striking.
Mm-hmm.
But again, just the sound of the song is what I'm so drawn to.
Mm-hmm.
I think that a lot of these songs start really slow and gentle. The first song, These Hands, is a very, very weirdly slow
Mm-hmm.
song to start on compared to the other starters that we've talked about in their past work.
I wear the customary clothes of my time, like Jesus did, with no reason not to die.
And it's almost not a letdown. I don't want to say
Mm-hmm.
that, but it's just a very somber sound to start on.
That you, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but would you say that it like doesn't? It's not as indicative of how the rest of the album is going to sound.
It's just not as immediately satisfying,
Mm-hmm.
which is something that I would say about some of the other songs on this
That was
album.
part two.
Well, yes,
Yeah.
exactly. But so the beginning of Into the Shadows of My Embrace just starts so abruptly that it's kind of it's satisfying to hear, and it puts a smile on your face. And the pattern of the song changes throughout it. It sounds a little bit more like the why that you love.
Right, yeah.
And yeah, the line that you just talked about, when it ends, it that whole line is so slow.
Right.
And then it just crescendos into this amazing ending where he talks about a memory from, I'm assuming, his childhood, of his the street he grew up on,
Right.
Cortelyou Place.
But you gotta yell something out you never tell nobody. We found a dead fox and a dozen matchbox cars when we cut back the hedges on Cortelyou Place. How many got lost, left so long they grew moss calls? They recalled into the shadows of my embrace. We found
And it's just so beautiful and exciting,
Yeah. I think it goes back into what we were talking about in Crushed Bones, where it's so satisfying to feel that build in intensity, and it sort of just like explodes. Like you said, it crescendos at the end.
Yeah.
And the end of the second verse for Into the Shadows of My Embrace, where he says, but you got to yell something. Like you find yourself screaming it whenever you're singing along to it. And then as soon as it's over, it doesn't like fall back down. It just goes straight into this new energetic part of the song, of the bridge. And even just driving on the way here, you can tell whenever you and I were having the most fun listening to this record, and it was on this song, because like Rachel had to grab the wheel at some point because I was like,
you weren't driving.
I was like flailing my arms because I would like this song fills me with so much like excitement and wonder, and it's probably because he's not talking about death as much as he has been in the rest of the record. This whole track is built around the idea that I was talking about at the end of the second verse, where the beginning is he says, "I conquered my own childhood silence."
I conquered my own childhood silence, and now the world is my lit confessional marquee.
And now the world is my lit confessional marquee. Like,
I love that line.
it's so good because you know, he's literally just telling you, like, here are all these really deeply personal experiences, and these are all like these crazy things that have happened to me, and I'm done holding it back. You know, like I've found catharsis in just kind of fucking screaming all these words out to anybody who's listening and anybody who's listened to this record. And I think that's definitely this track is the strongest part of this entire record by far.
Yeah, and what you were just talking about a little bit earlier about people using social media as a kind of diary where they can have a release to people without having to have a conversation about it one-to-one. That's obviously what he's doing. He's making music that is being released to, you know, thousands of people, but he doesn't actually have to look them in the face
Right, yeah.
when he tells them. And something that I was talking about to you in the car was re-listening to all of these albums, but especially Alopecia and this album feels almost more invasive now that, you know, we as fans have gotten a little bit closer with Yoni and the band through the rise of social media.
Right.
It almost feels like more upsetting to really, really not know Yoni because we're not close with him, but to see him and to know that he was going through those things.
Because you can put a face and you can put a personality to these
Exactly.
deeply troubling personal experiences.
Because before, when I listened to these albums in my car, you know, it was just kind of like a faceless person.
And you could like pick what you decided to relate to.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It was very much about myself. And the albums are more and more, I'm really understanding more where they're coming from his experiences, and that just makes them all the more meaningful.
But like you said, feeling almost a little bit invasive, like you.
Very.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to talk about these. And like I said, I always want to know where a person was whenever they were writing or whenever they were making a particular song. But I would never be able to bring myself to like ask these very specific questions about these lyrics that I have questions about, because I mean that's his life, you know, and I don't want to infringe on that. You know, he wrote about what he wrote about for himself for his own reasons. And that should be good enough, you know. And he made a beautiful piece of art out of it. I talked a little bit about Eskimo Snow, despite the fact that it, you know, a lot of the subject matter is similar to that of Alopecia. More, it feels a little bit more questioning and almost a little bit more hopeful in senses. And I think that that idea shines the most brightly on One Rose, where he says, "Always one rose grows through a littered lot of gravel." You know, kind of like seeing the silver lining on this horrible situation that he's, you know, had, whether health wise or, you know, emotional wise or, you know, anything like that. It's
always one rose grows through a littered lot of gravel. Always struck dumb and doomed when it doesn't.
It's the one shining beacon of light throughout the rest of this album that maybe indicates he might be okay at some point.
Right.
Yeah.
I like the phrase you use, silver lining.
But yeah, that's another standout line, because I think it's, whether or not it's an indicator of how the entire album sounds, I think it's a good indication of where his future lies, or where he will be at a point where maybe he's over this this really deeply troubling stuff. Did you have another track that you wanted to talk about?
I kind of wanted to mention the song January 20-something.
Right.
A little bit. It's really short. It's only about 2 minutes long, actually. But the transition from the first song, These Hands, into January 20-something does remind me of a transition from, I think it's into the Song of the Sad Assassin, or maybe into A Sky for Shooting Horses Under on Alopecia. The sound of the keyboard in the background really reminds me of A Sky for Shooting Horses Under.
Right.
That you know, so there's okay.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. But you know, the sound of the instrumentation in that song, when I really close my eyes and imagine it with that, you know, with the Horses album cover that Alopecia has, I can kind of see that song on
that record.
Alopecia. You can almost actually do that if you imagine like one of these songs thrown into alopecia as some kind of transition song or as a lull in between these mumble rap songs. Right. I can kind of almost imagine it, but not all of them.
Yeah, and I mentioned that one of the strongest lyrics of like all of Y's discography, in my personal experience, being that really cathartic release towards the end of Into the Shadows of My Embrace. There's another line that I just like for the poetic nature of it. It doesn't necessarily have contribute a whole bunch to the discography or the feeling or anything like that, but he talks about in I think it's on This Black is Pursed, where he says, I want to speak at an intimate decibel.
I want to speak at an intimate decibel with the precision of an infinite decimal, to listen up and send back a true echo of something forever felt but never heard.
I just like, whenever I first heard that line, like it really jumped out to me. Probably the second or third time I heard the song, I just lost my mind. I was like, did he just say that? Like that's one of the most beautiful lines I've heard in like any song for whatever reason. I mean, like it's used as a transition piece throughout the song. It isn't feeding directly into the whole idea of the song or the whole idea of the record, but just this sort of like one piece of a throwaway line used so casually, but it's like so poetic and so beautiful, it sticks out to me. Like I listen to that track and I wait for that lyric, despite the fact that it doesn't, like I said, feed directly into the entire idea of the song itself. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about the actual last track on
Wait,
Eskimo Snow.
do you want to go away from This Black is Pursed so quickly?
Oh yeah, no, if you have anything else to say about it.
That is definitely probably my other favorite on this album, along with Into the Shadows of My Embrace, just because it's a little longer. It gives you more time to sit with it, and it has more kind of a crescendo feel, whereas the other songs are a little more kind of lull you.
I think it goes kind of hand in hand with Into the Shadows, where it's one of the most fun songs to listen to and to sing along to on this record, because it's the most round. It's probably the loudest. It's the most upbeat. It's got the most ups and downs.
Yeah, and it's really, I don't want to say lonely. There's something about this whole album that the word lonely just makes me feel, or I think of the word lonely when I hear this album. But This Black is Pursed, I can't really say that I know too much of what it's about. I think it's very, I don't know if that's just me having a hard time understanding lyrics in general, but just the sound of it is so, I want to say cathartic, obviously in a different way from other tracks we've talked about in the past, but it sounds like almost like a movie soundtrack or something. Like, it's just, the chorus is so
I think that's a good way to put it, like a movie, like a track off of a movie soundtrack. I think it's probably one of the most narrative tracks, while being completely, or I say completely, I'm not entirely sure how the idea of a poser and the bowler or the small fry and a bow tie ties into his own personal experiences, but it's the most like story-like, and he's talking about these characters rather than himself or his own experiences, and in a really fun, kind of clever, almost funny way.
Well, and I think the line, "Mom, am I failing?" Just when anybody says "mom," is just personal.
Yeah.
And yeah, this song is just so gorgeous, and it's definitely one of my favorites on the album.
Yeah, this one and Into the Shadows of My Embrace, I think, are two of the most standout tracks, along with Against Me. I think that one's
Against Me is a great one.
Powerful, yeah.
Yes.
You want to talk about that one for a little bit?
Yeah, let's talk about Against Me.
Yeah. Right, and I talked a little bit about this album being a little bit more contemplative, and this album being a little bit more like almost hopeful, but him questioning his like how these horrible experiences that he's had will play into his future. Will play into the rest of his life. Where he says, "Out of every woman on earth, who will I mate with?" This whole verse he's talking about like what's gonna happen to me is like, am I gonna just be burned off the face of the earth with absolutely no, history, with no legacy to leave behind, where he says, will all my unused seed collect like mercury, like.
Out of every woman on earth, who will I mate with, or will I spit empty threats? years until all that's left is a million zeros printed on a roll of ticker tape. And one last echo of the final tiny wave in my wake. Will all my unused seed collect like mercury in some kind of afterlife or halves? Should I offer up my lats and pecs, estates and death?
What is he going to leave behind, basically, because death is so
present
in his mind
at this time.
It's at the forefront of everything he's thinking about. And so he's kind of just like, oh shit, what, how is the world going to progress, or how is my own life going to progress past my own life, kind of thing, which I think plays really strongly into the idea of this whole album. Yeah, just him not having any idea where his life is going to go from here, and kind of, it's almost like he's scared a little bit, in a lot of these lyrics
I feel that
he's
I think that's where the loneliness comes from.
Right.
It feels like, whereas, again, we keep comparing it to alopecia, but it's impossible not to. Alopecia feels very much like a nihilism, a kind of...
Right, yeah.
But this album feels like, because he's starting to feel something again, there is a fear in that isolation.
Right.
Also, in Against Me, the line where he says, I, like everybody else, is ashamed of sleep. I lie when a phone call wakes me.
That's right, I'm like everybody else is ashamed of sleep. I lie when a phone call wakes me.
That's a great line.
Yeah, I also woke Rachel earlier today with a phone call because I wasn't sure when she was going to come to the studio. So we were just talking about that, how she always has felt a deep connection to that line, and then talking about this record today, exactly that happened to
Yeah,
me.
relatable.
Yeah, how about that? But talking a little bit about the last track, the title track on Eskimo Snow, I wanted to talk a little bit about this, I think, in Alopecia, but I decided to wait until Eskimo Snow. This is the one track on any of his albums that is a title track. He doesn't have any other title tracks. He doesn't have a song called Oakland Azul Asylum. He doesn't have a song called Alopecia. He doesn't have a song called Elephant Eyelash.
You're right.
He doesn't have a song called Mumps.
He name drops those things.
He does.
But
and this is actually just a fun fact, that initially that's not how it was going to be. On Alopecia, he mentioned to me that the vowels part 2.
What do you mean he mentioned to you?
We had a conversation last February. I did a super quick interview with him for my radio station. And he mentioned to me specifically.
Yes. We understand.
No, he mentioned to me that in the vowels part 2, that was originally going to be called Alopecia.
Oh.
And on Mumps, Jonathan's Hope was originally going to be called Mumps, etc. And he was going to call the album Mumps, etc., etc. Like the album is this song and then some, Mumps, etc., etc. But for one reason or another, in both of those recording sessions, he decided, Jonathan's Hope felt more indicative of what that song was going to be like, or the vowels part 2. He didn't necessarily, I don't think he mentions the word alopecia at all in the entirety of Alopecia.
I don't think he does either. And I can't even recall, at least in that album time, he talks about losing hair. Mm-hmm. I know he does talk about hair a little bit.
Yeah.
In a lot of his songs, but that I can recall, I don't think he doesn't mention about it.
He doesn't drop the word alopecia anywhere in there. I don't think he drops. No, he does drop Mumps and Mumps, etc. He says,
yeah, in the very first line,
which I think is so good. It's such a good way to set up that entire album. We can talk about that more next week whenever we talk about Mumps. But whenever he says, "I got better from the Mumps, yes, my swollen nut and neck shrunk," it's kind of like you can see that he's taking this more like almost lighthearted, fun approach to all of these things that have happened to him. But yeah, so Eskimo Snow is the only title track in all of his discography. There's no song called Mothleen.
Yeah.
And it's also, I talked a little bit about how at the end of Mumps, at the end of Elephant Eyelash, and at the end of Alopecia, he talks about his death very explicitly in Alopecia. He talks about exegesis. I recently realized that's how it's pronounced, so sorry about that. At the end of Elephant Eyelash, he says, when my balls are finally big enough to do it, he'll hold his own death as a card in the deck. But in Eskimo Snow, he talks, he's been talking about death the entire record, and it's not absent in this song whatsoever. But he's got these lines that he repeats at the end where he says, "Then I'm still here, bearing my watery fruits if fruits at all. I'm still here." Like he's saying like,
then I'm still here, still here, barely understanding what truth that rarely calls.
I'm hanging on by a thread, but you know, at the end of the day, like, I am still here. I'm not gone. I'm not dead yet. I might be terrified of the idea that I'm going to die soon and what impact that's going to have on, you know, whatever legacy I decide to leave behind. But I'm still here, barely understanding what truth that rarely calls. Like, it's the only. I think it plays in a little bit more to the idea of this album sounding a little bit more hopeful than Alopecia. At the end of Alopecia, you know, he's just straight up, like, basically, like I said last week, it's almost like a suicide note. But this one is like another one of those beacons of light, another one of those silver linings where he's just like, you know, at the end of this track, at the end of this record, at the end of all this talking about death, he's like, well, I'm still here. So that was one thing that stood out to me that I didn't even realize until I listened to this album relatively recently, within the past probably couple years or so, that this is the only title track and the one out of most of his records that does not talk deliberately about his own death.
Yeah, I think this song makes me feel similar in the way that This Blackest Purse makes me feel.
Mm-hmm.
This very lonely yet hopeful kind of, there's a silver lining, but it's also confusing. And I think it's a beautiful end track. I know I say that word a lot, but I think it applies here especially well.
Mm-hmm.
I would really love to hear more Eskimo Snow songs live.
Right. Actually, yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because we looked up.
Should.
Yeah, we looked up the set list of the Eskimo Snow tour. We got the set list for October 28th and the set list for October 30th.
Oh, we looked it up. We were not at these shows.
Correct. We were not. Yeah, I would have been 13. Right? But we looked it up before we started recording. We do a lot of preemptive research before we jump right into the recording booth. But so we looked up the set list for the Eskimo Snow tour that they did. You said it came out in September, right?
Right. So it's really about a month after.
About a month after this
the album
comes out. You know, most bands are touring really, really hard on a record whenever it comes out, and I don't think this necessarily played in directly to people's sort of dismissal of this album. But we looked it up, and between these two set lists, and they were almost completely different set lists.
Yeah.
Both sets only had a third of the set list from Eskimo Snow, like as Eskimo Snow tracks. The rest of it was mostly Alopecia and then a little bit of Elephant Eyelash.
Yeah, it was about 5 songs.
Yeah, 5 songs each.
Out of 15.
Right. So exactly
that was
a third,
Eskimo Snow songs, which for an album tour is very surprising.
Yeah, and then we looked up the streaming numbers on Eskimo Snow, especially compared to the rest. I think
really low.
Probably the most loops they had, at least on Spotify, for any track on Eskimo Snow was probably about 300,000, something like that.
At the most.
Yeah. And
whereas Alopecia has up to 3 million.
Yeah, on probably their most streamed song is about 3 million. Just on Spotify, you know, not counting downloads or Apple Music or anything like that. So even just streaming numbers and the band's apparent own preference for Alopecia, I think may have played in a little bit to people sort of preferring Alopecia over Eskimo Snow. And like I said, since it did release so quickly after Alopecia, I don't think people were over that record yet.
I'm still not over that record.
Yeah, I never will be over that record. But I think people, we're still taking time to listen to it, and they've still bumped it. You know, like I said, this album is what got Y to where they are now, I would say.
Alopecia?
Yeah, Alopecia.
Yes.
Yeah. And Eskimo Snow just, you know... And I'm speaking from my own personal experiences and other Y fans that I've spoken to, not even just limited to you or Diane, but there's a tendency to have Eskimo Snow sort of as a companion piece as to Alopecia rather than its own standalone record. And everything, like I said, from the streaming numbers to the set list sort of plays into that. But weirdly enough, like I said, critically speaking and objectively speaking, it's still got really good reviews, unlike Mumps, which we'll talk about next week. You know, we're going to wrap up the episode here, but sort of your little hook to listen to next week. Mumps did not do well. It came out about 3 years after Eskimo Snow, which you would think would be enough time to, you know, breathe and anticipate a new record. And they tried something new, and apparently critically and objectively it just didn't work. I love the shit out of that album.
Love Mumps, etc. And it's really because we'll talk about it more next episode, but Diane and I really got into why around this era,
right,
which is why we love Mumps, etc. so much. So I was really disappointed when I found out about the critical reviews of that album and even some of the fan opinions of that album.
Right.
But again, we'll talk about that a little more next
Yeah,
week.
and I think doing, like I said, Rachel and I do a pretty cursory amount of research beforehand, and in doing this podcast and in doing a bunch of this research, we've been surprised by a lot of things. You know, we've sort of had our own small world, our own like ideas about why the reception was, or how their albums have been,
Received.
how they withstand the test of time and stuff like that. And I've been surprised almost every single episode. We've looked something up that has blown my mind. But yeah, like I said, we'll talk more about that next week. This is the end of the episode.
It's dramatic.
Yeah. So we'll be back next week with our episode on Mumps, etc. But until then, thank you again, Noah and Gavin and the Archive Network for having us. We super duper appreciate it.
Yeah, we're really appreciative. We're having so much fun.
This is the first, I may have mentioned last week, we've been having these conversations for the past 4 years that we've known each other. This is the first time we've taken a mic to it.
We've known each other longer than that.
Yeah, but we've been talking about these songs, I think, probably about 4 years.
I guess so.
Yeah, 4 or 5 years. And this is the first time we've taken a mic to it, so it's been just like super fun, kind of just chatting about it. But yeah, so that will be the Mumps episode will come out next week.
Until next time.
See ya.